So if you find this sleep story helpful or interesting, then give it a thumbs up, leave any comments that you've got below, and if you aren't already, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you can receive notifications of when future sleep stories go live. I have dozens and dozens of stories already on my channel that you can go and search. I also release new stories every single week, so I hope you enjoy this story. Just take a moment to allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to begin to relax. And as you begin to comfortably drift asleep, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster to the sound of my words, or whether it'll be to the spaces between my words. And while you begin to drift comfortably asleep, I'm just going to tell a story in the background. And it's a story about a woman who lives in a really nice country house. And she's sitting in her back garden, admiring the views down that garden, drinking a drink, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and just feeling a sense of peace, calm and relaxation. And she's watching as the bees fly in and out of the roses on the trellis at the back of the garden, that kind of arches around a path. She watches as butterflies land on the flowers down the side of the garden, and admires the different types of butterflies. And she can see the colourful birds landing in trees, singing so beautifully, and the way all the plants just gently sway in the breeze. And as she just sits and watches, she starts gazing up towards the sky, noticing whether there's any clouds up there, thinking about how some clouds can look like different shapes, different animals. And sometimes it's the spaces between the clouds that create the shapes or animals. And as she gazes at the sky, so she begins to feel herself relaxing even deeper, listening to the songbirds, feeling the slightest breeze on her cheeks, and that warmth of the sun, and the wafts of the smell from the flowers. And while relaxing deeper and deeper into the experience, she lets her eyes gently close. And as her eyes gently close, so she has this feeling of drifting out of her body and beginning to float up into the sky. And she can see her house down there. And she feels so light and free, and feels a sense of peace and calm. And that pleasant floating feeling, almost like lying on your back in water and floating on your back, where you can see above you and you feel weightless and relaxed. She notices how her breathing is slowing and relaxing. And as she continues to float higher and higher and further from her home, she sees off in the distance a larger cloud, and she begins to get closer and closer to that larger cloud that looks almost like a giant crumpled up ball of cotton wool that looks so soft, or a crumpled up ball of silk. And as she gets nearer and nearer, she realizes there's the most perfectly white palace on this cloud. And she lands on that cloud so easily and effortlessly, landing on her feet. And walks along that soft cloud, with each footstep barely making a sound. And the cloud comfortably resisting her feet, like walking on a lawn with short grass, where there's just a little bit of resistance, a little bit of sponginess, but at the same time there's a certain firmness to that ground. But unlike a lawn, there's almost no sound from each footstep. And she walks toward the palace. And as she nears that palace, so she notices a road or a path beginning to form in front of her. That looks like it's made out of pure white stone. But as she walks on it, she notices that it feels more like it's somehow a condensed version of the cloud. And she follows that path, and finds her way to a bridge, and notices that it's a drawbridge, and that drawbridge gets lowered over what looks like a sparkling silver river flowing across the cloud. And she walks across that bridge, noticing a slight clippity-clop of her feet on the wood, before carrying on to an almost noiseless steps the other side. And she heads up and into the palace, knocking on the door of the palace, opening that door, feeling invited as she walks in, being aware of how light and airy the palace seems, as light shines in through stained glass windows, illuminating areas of the floor with the most beautiful colours, and other windows higher up, shining pure white light down into the space below. And then mirrors around different pillars and in different locations, reflecting that light around and spreading that light out, reflecting onto the white walls then having it reflecting off the white walls, softening that light, creating the most beautiful glow inside this palace. And she walks through the enormous hallway area, thinking to herself how this one space would be large enough to use like a ballroom. And she heads through another door, into another chamber. And this chamber is far more cosy. Unlike the section she just came from, where the floor looked like marble but barely made a sound. This floor looks almost like it's carpeted. And although it also barely makes a sound, the slight sound that it does make has a duller tone to it. And that dull tone barely echoes within this room. And she notices that around the walls of the room are enormous numbers of books, stacked higher than you could reach, all around those walls. And sitting at the far end of the room, in an armchair, is what looks like a princess reading a book. And she doesn't look up, doesn't flinch, doesn't acknowledge that you've entered the room, as if she's totally engrossed in that book, and just turning those pages. And as the woman walks towards her, so she begins to get curious about what this book must be that's so absorbing. And just as she's almost upon this princess, the princess closes the book, puts it down beside her, and looks up, and then gestures to the comfortable seat behind her. And the woman sits down in that comfortable seat, almost feeling like she's sitting down deeper than she sat down before, as if somehow there's some kind of magical property to this comfortable seat. And the princess starts talking to her and telling her that she's going to go on a journey. She's going to go on a bit of an adventure of discovery. And that there's something she's going to learn from this. Something she'll gain inside herself. But there's something that she needs to take with her. And the princess stands up, walks over to the bookshelves, slides a ladder along the bookshelves, climbs up that ladder all the way to the top, grabs a small box, climbs back down again, moves that ladder back over again, and sits back down, lifting the lid of the box, revealing a pocket watch. And she pops open that pocket watch. And as she does, the woman can hear the ticking from the pocket watch. And she glances over at that pocket watch. and notices that it seems to be keeping good time. And on the inside of the lid is the most beautiful gold that looks so pristine, and carved into that is an elaborate pattern of shapes that are all interlocking. And behind the hands of that pocket watch, she can see the cogs moving. And behind the cogs, she can notice the way the light seems to be reflecting off that back deep inside the watch and then back out again. As if somehow there's depth to this watch, like there's more back there than she realizes. And the princess tells her that this watch will stop, and when the watch stops, the time that it stops at is the time she needs to know. So she needs to keep an eye on this watch, check it regularly. And the watch will continue once that time comes around at the right time. And that'll let her know that that moment is the right time. And there'll be a sense of connection. And the woman's a little confused by this. She feels it's a little vague. But she gets handed that pocket watch. She feels the weight of that in her hand. She closes the lid. And the princess doesn't give her the box. She just closes that box, puts it down beside her. And the woman puts that pocket watch into her pocket. And the princess ushers her to leave. And so she finds her way back through the palace, back out of that palace, back over that bridge, walks along the cloud, and with just a simple thought, she floats up from that cloud and begins to float and drift back down towards herself. And as she does, she gazes back, and she can see a sheet of rain gently falling from that cloud, and recognizes that the location it's falling at the bottom of the cloud is in line with that river that seemed to be passing across in front of the palace. And she wonders whether that river has a leak in the bottom of it somehow. And she floats down towards herself, arrives back at her property, drifts inside herself, and then feels herself move a little bit and drift back in that garden. And as she drifts back in that garden, she wonders whether that was just a dream. And then she fills her pocket, puts her hand in her pocket, and discovers that pocket watch. And she thinks that that's an unusual experience to have had. wondering how it could even be possible. And yet the pocket watch proves that she had had that experience. And after having another drink and relaxing in this garden, while the sun is beginning to set, she decides to walk inside her house a moment, to think about what this all means. And she sits inside, and to keep comfortable inside, she sits by her fire, because although it's warm during the day, she's aware it gets cooler at night. And while sitting by the fire, her cat Pickles jumps up on her lap, curls around, and then slumps down on her lap. And she gently strokes Pickles on its back, behind its ear. And with each stroke she notices that purring, and can feel the purring through her hand. And something about Pickles lying there purring, and the sensation of the weight of Pickles resting there, brings a sense of peace, of calmness and comfort to her, almost as if somehow the purring of Pickles slows her breathing, helps her muscles relax, and helps her just drift and float peacefully with the experience. And she's aware that she's going to go out for the evening. She wants to begin to just drive around and try and work out what this all means. And she feels that if she can drive around a little bit, maybe it'll make sense. And with Pickles on her lap, she looks at that pocket watch. She opens the pocket watch. She can hear it ticking away. And she closes that pocket watch, puts Pickles down on the ground, and decides to go out for a drive for a little bit, to see if anything will stimulate her mind and give her an idea of what this all means. And she gets into a farm truck that belongs to a neighbour of hers, that lets her drive it around this area. And she drives across the fields. She drives over the muddy tracks. She drives all the way to a distant lake, many miles from her home, parks up the truck, and from in the truck she gazes out the windscreen over the lake, watches as the moon rises in the sky, the way that full moon illuminates the water, like dancing splinters of silver on the water. She leaves the truck closes that door behind her, walks down to the water's edge. And sits by the water's edge, just resting her feet into that cool water. And as she rests there, gazing up at the sky, hearing that incredibly gentle lapping on the shore, that slight tickling around her legs as that water rolls in and out, looking as the finest clouds pass in front of the moon, creating a rainbow in the sky from the moonlight. Noticing the twinkling of those stars, the occasional shooting star. She takes out that pocket watch, flips open the lid, and to try and see the time, she tilts the watch towards the moon. And as she does, she notices a rainbow jump out of the watch and split apart and shine up in the sky. And she realizes somewhere deep inside that watch is some kind of a prism that seems so sensitive that it's able to take that moonlight and, as well as splitting it into the colours of the rainbow, it seems to be able to amplify that light. And as she moves her hand, she notices that rainbow disappear, and then she moves her hand back and notices it appear again. Then she looks at where that rainbow's going, at where that multicoloured light seems to be reflecting. She wonders if this has anything to do with what's supposed to happen. And as she looks at the hands, she sees that the different hands are passing through different colours, and that the lights seem to be colouring the different parts of the internal part of this watch with those different colours. And then she notices that the two hands stop, and the ticking stops. And she looks at what that time is, and she looks at the colours that the hands are shining through. And she shakes that watch a little bit to see if it'll start that ticking again. She puts it to her ear, can't hear any ticking. So she clicks that lid shut, and she has this strangest sense, almost like she just shut a lid on a rainbow. As if perhaps, as long as she doesn't open it and look, that rainbow will be trapped in there and exists. But she worries that if she pops it open, that bit of rainbow she's trapped will escape and be gone forever. And so she keeps that pocket watch closed, puts it in her pocket, can hear the occasional noise of the evening animals. And then decides to go back to the truck and make her journey back home again. And once home, she goes to bed, drifts off asleep, still wondering what this all means. She now has a time, and she knows something will happen at that time, but she doesn't know when that time will happen. She knows she just has to look out for a time that that clock starts ticking again. And she goes to bed and she begins to comfortably drift asleep in bed. And she can hear the gentle ticking of a clock in her room. As she relaxes and drifts asleep. And the next morning, she wakes up early. She has some breakfast. And she's planning on going to the beach. But it's a long drive to the beach. So she gathers herself up some food, a packed lunch for the journey. Says goodbye to Pickles, and watches as Pickles initially seems interested, and she thinks, oh, Pickles is going to miss me, before Pickles jumps up in her chair, turns around, slumps down, rests its head on its paws, and seems to just fall asleep where it is. And she closes the front door and starts her drive to the beach. And as she drives to the beach, so the sun begins to rise. And she looks at the colours of the sky and how those colours change as her journey continues. And after many hours she stops off at a meadow on the way, sits in that meadow, eats her packed lunch, enjoys watching the wildlife around her, and then continues her journey to that beach. And at the beach she takes her shoes off, walks along the most beautiful white sand, and can feel that sand through her toes, noticing the way her feet sink into the sand by the water, and the way the sand tickles her feet when she's walking away from the water in that dry and dusty sand. And she can hear that water gently lapping and rolling onto the shore, and then rolling back out to sea. And while walking along, she sees a rowboat, and she decides to take that rowboat out to an island a little way offshore. And when she makes this trip, she quite likes rowing out, or perhaps even sometimes swimming out to the island, because most people don't go to that kind of effort. And so it's always deserted. It's always a place of peace and calm, somewhere that she can gather her thoughts. And so she rows out towards that island, arrives at the island, climbs out of the boat, drags it up just onto the shore. And then sits down under the most beautiful palm trees that were just enough shelter from the sun so that she could relax and just take in the environment, listening to the way the water rolls onto the shore, hearing the sound of leaves moving in the breeze, and resting against the palm tree, occasionally with a slightly stronger gust of wind. She can even feel the slight movement of that palm tree behind her. And as she rests there, just gazing out to sea, so she notices some dolphins swimming along, occasionally jumping in the air, flipping, splashing in the water, other times jumping high, and yet landing nose first so gracefully they barely seem to disturb the surface. Marvelling at the control that they seem to have over their actions. And then she is surprised to hear a voice from behind her. And slightly startled, she turns around to see this woman walking across this deserted island from behind her, from the other side of the island. She wonders where this woman had come from. There's nowhere to have rowed from or swam from on that side of the island. And she walks over and sits down next to the woman. And this woman is confused who this other woman is and where she came from. And she asks, and the woman says that she came from the Emerald Palace. And this woman wonders what the Emerald Palace is, saying that she doesn't know of any palaces around here. And this woman tells her that it's very nearby, and that she can take her if she wants. But she'll have to leave some things behind on this island, just for now, but she'll be back. And the woman agrees, with curiosity. And so she leaves the pocket watch. She leaves a few other items she's got with her. She double checks that the boat is securely up on the shore. And then that woman reaches over, takes her hand, and starts walking towards the far side of the island. And she pulls the woman gently into the water, saying to follow me, that you're going to enjoy this experience, but it may be confusing at first. And the two of them begin to walk into that water. And this woman rests her hand gently in the centre of the back of the woman. And the woman feels this strange warmth passing through her back, passing through her chest, around her neck, up to her cheeks, around her face. And then this woman looks her in the eye, says, "Trust me." And then the two of them dive into the water, and as they do, bubbles start appearing around the lower half of this woman. And as the bubbles clear, the woman realizes that this person's actually a mermaid, that takes her by surprise, seeing this tail behind her. And she's even more surprised by the fact that the tail isn't scaly, as she imagined a mermaid's tail would be. But then she thought to herself, that's probably not a surprise really, given that if this mermaid can breathe air, maybe this mermaid is a mammal. Rather than a fish. And the mermaid's tail was going up and down, rather than side to side. And this woman spent so much time thinking about the fact she just realised that this person is a mermaid, that she didn't even notice at first that she hadn't needed to breathe, that she seemed to be just so comfortably holding her breath, as if it's the most effortless, comfortable thing in the world. She wasn't trying to hold her breath, but she also wasn't trying to breathe. She was just comfortable, swimming deeper and deeper. And she could hear the underwater sounds, hear the movement of waves overhead, see rays of sunlight shimmering and dancing as they were swimming further away from those rays. And everything began to get darker the deeper they swam. And then the mermaid reached over with her other hand, gently touched the woman on the forehead, and she noticed her vision improving. Suddenly she could see better, almost as if she had better eyesight to see in low light. And then as they swam deeper and deeper, she began to notice this emerald glow. Initially it looked almost like just a shimmering emerald colour in the sea, somewhere off in the distance. And then the closer they got to this glow, the more she noticed that it was a glowing emerald palace deep under the ocean here. And she could see all these mermaids and mermen swimming around the palace, swimming into the palace, swimming out of the palace. She could see people swimming on the backs of whales, travelling even faster and even deeper, some riding whales up towards the surface. She could see some seemingly herding fish, It was as if there was an entire community down here that she was totally unaware of. But she was aware that she would have thought this was a strange experience if it hadn't been for the experience she'd had the day before. And she didn't believe the experience she'd had the day before until she found that she still had the pocket watch. And now she was having this experience. And the two of them swam into that palace. And inside the palace there was a location almost like an airlock where they swam in. And then the water level started lowering. And then as the water level lowered, so the mermaid's tail turned back into legs. And by the time the water had drained, she was stood there, looking as human as she did before. And she rested her hand on the forehead of the woman, rested her other hand on the back of the woman. The woman felt that warmth and felt that feeling on her forehead and around her eyes. And then the mermaid said that she just put her breathing and her vision back to normal for now, while they're in the palace. And she looked behind her and could see what looked like the water resting against nothing, as if the water was just there. She had this feeling like she could just put her hand out and touch that water, or perhaps even put her hand straight through the water into the rest of the ocean. But she didn't want to, just in case she wasn't supposed to. And the two of them walked into the palace, and she wondered why this mermaid found her, how this mermaid found her, and why this mermaid brought her here. And as they walked in the palace, initially their footsteps sounded wet as their damp feet walked on that solid surface. And it was almost like walking on solid glass. And she could see the wet footsteps left behind her, noticing those footprints. And then they walked through a part of the palace that seemed almost carpeted, but it seemed like a natural carpet, like everything in this part of the palace was alive, like walking through grass. And the mermaid said that she's aware that the woman had been and seen the princess in the palace in the cloud, and that that watch had stopped, and that there's something important about this woman. She just doesn't know it yet. Like many people, we have a purpose in life. We just don't necessarily know it. And the woman was intrigued. The mermaid said she's got something she's going to give her. And she walks her to this incredibly comfortable seat. She sits down on that seat, almost like resting down in water, somehow just being weightless on that seat, almost having a feeling of floating while sitting on the seat. The mermaid then heads off to grab something. And the woman recognizes that this room vaguely resembles the palace in the sky, except this is deep under the ocean. And this palace is an emerald colour, whereas the palace in the sky was bright white. And that mermaid returns. And she returns with another pocket watch. Only this pocket watch is broken. And she says that it's a special watch. But it's only when it's ticking again that she'll know that the moment is right. And the woman wonders about these vague messages about moments being right, and why all these clocks are going to start ticking at the right time. And so she takes that pocket watch, and she's told that she needs to go and get it fixed. And then the mermaid leaves this palace with her. They swim back up through the ocean, back to that deserted island. And back on the deserted island, the woman sits under that palm tree. She has a drink from a fresh coconut. She wonders about the experience so far. She looks at the two watches. She notices their similarities and their differences. She turns them over and looks at the back of them. She doesn't want to pop open the one she got from the palace in the clouds, but she pops open this new one. She listens and can't hear any ticking. She shakes it and can't hear any rattling. She wonders what's wrong with it. She tries to wind it up, but nothing happens. And she puts them both in her pocket and decides just to rest there for a little bit longer before heading back to the main shoreline. Because resting here, she can hear the seagulls overhead. She can watch dolphins out to sea, listen to the way the waves break on the shore. And while resting on this island, she builds herself a hammock between two of the trees, climbs into that hammock, and starts reading a book. And she gently tries to swing that hammock just a little bit. giving herself a feeling of almost rocking into relaxation. And as she rocks deeper into relaxation, reading that book, a part of her mind is still elsewhere, wondering about the meaning of the watches. And she waits until gone the middle of the day, keeping protected under the canopies of the trees, before heading back to her boat and rowing that boat back to shore. And back on shore she walks along through that beautiful white sand. And she begins to hear some circus music in the distance, and notices that way off down the shore near the pier, there's a circus tent, there's a fairground, and she can see as families are heading along the pier, are heading into that fair, are heading into that circus tent. And she decides to wander down, investigate it for herself, before she'll walk back and journey back home. And so she wanders along the shore, and the closer she gets to the fairground, to the circus, the louder that music gets, and the more she notices how many people are there. And she can see that there's obviously a show going on in that circus tent, and children are coming out with balloons and big smiles on their faces. And she decides to get onto the merry-go-round and have a quick ride on that, listening to that music as she bobs up and down, travelling round and round, watching the lights and all the action around her. But she finds that her mind is still wandering and drifting and wondering. And she leaves this area with some candy floss and eats that candy floss as she walks along, feeling the way it's melting in her mouth, the way it tickles her nose when it accidentally touches her nose, the way her fingers become sticky as it gets on her fingers. She washes her hands as she finishes that candy floss. And walks along the shore a little further, just to find somewhere quiet for a moment, to still think and ponder. And along the shore, there's a few small shops, and normally she tries to avoid going this far down. She likes the area of the beach, where there's just sand and countryside and nature. She's not so much a fan of coming to the built-up area, to the pier, to the shops. And as she walks along, so she can see these quaint shops, the signs of what they all are. And she notices that one of them is a watchmaker's. And she wonders whether they could fix the watch. She doesn't know what she'll say if she's asked where it's from, but she'll just try and be vague. And she heads into that quaint watchmaker's store, bell ringing as she walks in, bell ringing as the door closes behind her. She can hear ticking coming from all directions around her, with the clocks over the walls, cabinets full of watches, and an elderly man, hunched over, with glasses, with a little microscope on the end of the glasses. And an item that seems to have the smallest end to it. He seems to be working on something, and he doesn't look up, he doesn't flinch, he doesn't respond at all to her entrance. He seems so focused on the job that he's doing. And so she looks at the different clocks around the wall. She looks in the cabinets at the different watches, and then goes and stands near the counter. And she waits for this elderly man to finish what he's doing. And she doesn't know how long it will take him, but she feels like it would be rude and not sensible to interrupt him when he looks like he's so busy and focused on a delicate job. And then after a little while, he finishes what he's doing and very carefully and slowly gazes up towards the woman, moves his head back as he sees her too close, and then remembers to take the glasses off, and says that you get so lost looking through them that the reality through them is all you end up seeing. You lose track of all the reality around the outside because you're just focused on the task at hand through the microscope. And that you have this feeling almost like you're in that tiny world. And all you can see is that very fine tip of the instrument you're using. And it feels like you're using a small instrument, despite the fact that you're using something that's very long in your hand. And he asks her what it is that she wanted. And she said that she's got a watch that needs fixing. And she takes the watch out of her pocket, the one from the Mermaid. She places it down on the counter. And he pops it open. And he makes a few noises, a few ums and ahs. He makes some noises of curiosity. He puts the glasses back on and takes a closer look. He takes the glasses off and asks where the watch came from. And the woman says that she got it in the sea. And he just responds with a, "Ah." and carries on looking. He doesn't seem to question her vagueness or what she was saying. And yet she's aware that it doesn't look like it's something that has been underwater, especially not like something that's been underwater in the ocean. And he looks up and says that he can fix this watch, but it'll take him just a little while. And that if she wants, she can sit and wait. He explains that he's got a small little lounge just through the back of the shop. And so she agrees that she'll sit and wait. She walks into that lounge, sits down in the lounge. And while she's sat there waiting, she begins to feel the sense like she's getting a bit bored, like she wants to twiddle her thumbs, wants to be doing something. And she doesn't know how long it'll take. And then a man walks in, and he sits down near her. He explains he's the watchmaker's son, and he thought he'd give her some company, and asks if she wants to go out for a little bit, for a bit of a walk along the seafront, rather than being cooped up here in this lounge. And together they wander along the seafront. They walk back near the pier. They walk on to a bench a little way on from the pier. They sit on that bench, gazing out to sea. And she asks the watchmaker's son what he does, what sort of things he's interested in. He explains that he's an artist, that he likes painting. He explains that he paints in an unusual way at times, that he's got a way of painting images in people's minds, that's kind of how he paints for real, that the painting happens in his mind, and then his hand just turns what's in his mind into reality. And he can help others to see that. And the woman's curious by this. And so he says, well, I'll have you paint the view in front of you. And the two of them stand up from the bench. He gently touches her shoulders, positions her to face out towards the sea. He stands in front of her, gently lifts her arms, so gently that it's almost as if he wasn't touching her arms, almost as if she can't tell whether she's lifting her own arms or he's lifting her arms. He moves her arms around a little, making sure her elbows are bent and the arms are in a comfortable position. He then moves back beside her, reaches around with one arm to reposition the far arm, while using his other hand to reposition the arm nearest to him. And then looking in front of her, with her, he says, just imagine an easel in front of you. And imagine it. So there's a canvas on that easel. And the canvas is just slightly lower than your eyes. And so your eyes can see the view over the canvas. And tilting your eyes down ever so slightly, you can see on the canvas. And just notice how pure and white that canvas is. Focus in on the canvas, notice the texture of the canvas, what it's made of. Almost noticing each individual thread on that canvas. It then tells her to breathe calmly and deeply, and to very slowly have a sense of reaching down as if there's a brush in the hand, dabbing some paint together of the colour of the sky, beginning to just loosely smear that onto the canvas, and notice how that begins to appear. Notice how some of it runs organically and naturally, just flowing on the canvas. And then dabbing some water, cleaning that brush off a little, and then dabbing a different colour, and doing that colour of the ocean. And initially just doing some quite loose colours, getting the bulk of the colours down, and then doing the same with the sand. And then beginning to dab in and add in some detail, and doing this so slowly and intentfully. And the woman found herself drifting and floating inside her mind, as if her body was working automatically. And she started having this feeling like she was genuinely painting. And then with that feeling started coming a vision as if that canvas was really there. And the way he was looking at the canvas, as if it was really there for him too, the way he gestured towards it, the way he helped to mark out different things on that canvas, with such conviction. And he talked about just noticing that slight waft of the smell of the paint, and hearing the sound of that brush on the canvas, hearing the sound of the brush in the paint, hearing the sound of that brush in the water, and the slight clinking sound as the brush taps on the side of that jar of water. And he guides her to paint. And once she's completed, she has this sense of putting the brush down. And he notices in her that she has completed the painting, and he praises her on that painting, and says you'll always have that painting with you. And then he taps her on the shoulder just very gently, and she feels this sense of drifting out of that reverie and paying attention to him again. And they sit down on the bench. She notices that that painting has disappeared, the easel has disappeared. But she's got that experience with her. And she feels a certain connection to this person. And while they sit there, the sun begins to set, and as the sun sets, so he just gently rests his arm around her, noticing that She had acted like she was just starting to get a little cold, and she allows that hug. She rests her arm back around him. She rests her head gently onto his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body against hers, feeling the tightness of that hug and the secureness of that, and feeling a sense of love and peace and a sense of harmony, being aware that they seem to be breathing the same and relaxing, and how this moment seems to be slowing down and standing still, as if the waves rolling on the shore are slowing down, having more space between each wave, and being in this moment. And she starts to feel a certain fluttering in her chest, a sense that there's more to this moment than she thought there would be, to this chance encounter. And after what felt like just a minute, but was probably much longer, the two of them started heading back to that shop. And as they arrived back in the shop, the watchmaker glanced up at them, gave a smile, and said that he's fixed that watch. And he placed that watch on the counter. He asked, "Do you have any other watches like it? It's a really interesting watch. If you do, I'd love to see them." And she says she's got another one in her pocket. She got it from a different location and said she couldn't really explain where. But it was nowhere near that watch. And she placed that down on the counter. And as the watchmaker pressed the button to pop open the lid, so a flash of rainbow light burst out of the watch, just for a split second, and the watch began ticking. And she realized that the time on the watch and the time that it currently is 24 hours later. And as she looks at the man beside her, she sees the way that he's smiling at her. She sees that it looks like he wants to ask her something. And she wants to be asked. And he asks if she's happy to see him again. And she says, "No. I'm happy to see you now." And she puts an arm around him to settle his moment of confusion. That moment she knows she made him worry just for a second, but knows that's why he smiled deeper than he had before. She sees that watchmaker smiling, She then says, let's go back to the beach. She tells him she's got an unusual story to say, and that he may not believe it. And she doesn't yet know what it means, but she knows somehow he's involved. And they walk down onto the beach. They light a small campfire. They cook some food on that campfire on the beach, while she shares her tale with him. And she's surprised that somehow he seems to be engaged with this tale, nodding, demonstrating intrigue and curiosity. And she shows the two watches and lets him examine them. And he asks questions about that palace in the clouds. He asks questions about the palace deep under the sea, about the mermaid. And a part of her thinks to herself, is it normal for someone to just take your word for everything like this, when you're telling them stuff that's so strange? And he then says he's also got a story to share. That he's the watchmaker's son, but he doesn't live there. That the previous day he'd had an experience where he was drifting off asleep, just relaxing at home. And then he found himself walking through some woods, exploring that woodland. And he encountered the most bizarre place that no one would believe if he told them. He encountered what looked almost like a partially see-through house. And he couldn't figure out how else to explain it. And he said that he felt compelled to walk to the door. He knocked on the door. And someone wearing purple robes, with a purple hat, and a black and white wand answered the door. And he was surprised by this at the time. But the person just smiled and seemed so friendly, and they invited him in. And as they closed the door behind them, he noticed the way all the walls just seemed to wobble and vibrate, as if the house was made of jelly. But something about the experience felt so comforting and natural. And he sat down on the chair he was gestured to sit in. And the house had this strong smell of chocolate. And then he realised the chair he was sitting in was like a giant chocolate cookie chair. And when this wizard turned their back, he tested his theory by breaking a piece off under his hand and quickly eating it before the wizard turned back again. And he said that this wizard was asking questions, and he was there trying to chew really fast, secretly, because the wizard was wondering why he wasn't answering. And the woman found this story amusing. This idea that he's doing something that's a bit cheeky. that it's almost like doing something just a little naughty in school and trying not to get caught. Nothing particularly wrong, just a bit cheeky and trying to get away with it. And she was hanging on his every word as he described this experience. He described how he was given a book, and he thought about how he loved reading books, and he was told not to open this book until he'd left this house, until he'd left the woodland. And he said that he left the house and he left the woodland. And when he opened the book, he found that after about page 48, there was no pages. A hole had been cut in the book. And he was a bit irritated by the damage to the book, thinking the wizard could have just given him a box and not damaged the book. But in that gap in the book was a watch, and the note with the watch said, "Take this to be fixed." He said that was the watch that his dad was working on when she arrived, and that was why he was there. That ordinarily he wouldn't have been there at that time, that he doesn't see his dad as often as he perhaps should, that he's normally too busy doing his own thing. And he said that the next day he'd had a similar bizarre experience, that this morning he woke up. He left his home. He knew that he was going to come and see his dad. He had the book in his car next to him, pocket watch in the book. And he pulled over at a location, and there was someone there who asked him if he could help them. And so he went and started to help. And he said it was the weirdest thing, that here they are in this hot environment, and there's this person creating an ice sculpture on the beach. And they're saying they want this sculpture finished before all the ice melts. And so he said he spent most of the morning carving a giant ice sphere on the seafront, somehow feeling like helping, despite knowing that no sooner as he finished creating this, it's going to all melt and run away, and that there's just going to be a moment to capture the beauty of the sculpture, and that anyone around beforehand or afterwards will miss out. And then he said that that was his reason for being so motivated to help. That there'll be just that moment in time when there's something precious, that if you can capture that, you can see that, and experience it, and share that experience with others. He described it like that moment you see a shooting star, and know that if you were looking moments earlier or moments later, if you were blinking, if you were looking down or looking elsewhere, or hadn't gone outside, you'd miss that moment. And this started to teach him about the preciousness of making the most of moments, making the most of wonder, of curiosity. And the two of them spoke as the sun had set, as the fire began to burn down to embers and was just glowing, illuminating that sand. The sound of the beach in the background, the coolness of the air, stars in the sky, the way the moon illuminated the ocean. And just then, a woman walked over and sat down on the ground, and she was instantly recognized as being the mermaid. And she said that the two of you have now found each other, that you're soulmates who are meant to be, that you've been missing each other for many years, that you've all nearly had your paths cross repeatedly, and that there's so much you're going to create together that's more than you create on your own. And that the universe just needed to give a little helping hand because of the things you'll be achieving, and that the future will unfold in its own way, in its own time. And that it's the discovery of that future, the curiosity, the wonder, that'll help to drive you both. And so the future's not going to be revealed, just that you need to face that future together. And your different learnings through the last 24 hours are complementary to the way forward. And the mermaid handed over a plate of strawberries, said a gift from us, before heading back down to the ocean, diving in and disappearing. And then the man walked the woman back to her car. She travelled back home with an excitement she hadn't felt for quite a while, about a new chapter of her life. She looked forward to excitedly telling her cat, although at the same time she wondered whether people would think that was strange, that she wants to get home and tell her cat about her experiences. And he headed home as well. They knew they were going to see each other in the future. And once home, after relaxing for a while, she went up to bed, settled down in bed, and with pleasant thoughts in her mind, thoughts of what the future holds, the positives, what she's got to look forward to, and understanding now about the connection and a broader sense of the world around her. With a smile that seemed to pass through her body, she drifted and comfortably floated and relaxed, asleep, sleeping deeply and soundly all night long.